Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be discussing what we're seeing as a historical, social and political unrest throughout the Middle East. We've seen the Muslim Brotherhood President Morsi deposed of power by the military junta in Egypt. So we'll be discussing what are the implications for the future of Egypt. We're seeing the ongoing civil war in Syria, which has already claimed the lives of over 100,000 Syrians, according to the United Nations, called a refugee problem of 1.5 million people. And we're also seeing how Syria is really at the forefront of a battle for the control and ideology of the Middle East between the Sunni and the Shia. And also be discussing how Israel can deal with these challenges, as well as the emergence of Turkey as a regional power. And these are the issues we'll be discussing in today's Middle East Report. Camille, welcome to the Middle East Report, all the way from Australia. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you on today's programme. Can you share with our viewers how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ?
Well, thanks, Simon. It's a pleasure to be with you. And as far as how I came to faith, I was born and raised in the United States. I'm what they call an Arab American, although I've now spent more of my time in Australia than America. I was raised by a great Middle Eastern Arab family, father from Jerusalem, mother from Lebanon, but wasn't raised anything. You know, Americans are taught to be free and find your own religion and, you know, that kind of thing. So it was at the age of 16, my mother decided to go back to her Syrian Orthodox church. They had an evangelical running the Sunday school because he was very, very effective. It was not what they normally would do, but in this case they did, and it was under his ministry that I came to faith.
Excellent. And where does your interest lie in the Middle East? Because this is your specialist subject. So it's also mine, which is good. So we have a lot in common today.
Well, I didn't originally have an interest in the Middle East. I didn't know anything about the area as I was growing up. It's only when I came to about 21 years old and gave myself to serve God that I waited on the Lord, and he sent me to the land of my fathers. And there I began to, I ended up doing a master's degree. It was in Jerusalem, in the history and geography of the Bible, and that one thing led to another.
Excellent. And also, coming from an Arab background, you've got a very interesting perspective on Israel and the Middle East. But how did you gain an understanding of the importance and significance of Israel in God's plans?
I am from Arab background, and I'm very familiar with the Arab history and politics and all that, and I do understand it. But I also was surrounded, not by my own choice, but by people who were what you call Christian Zionists. So I would say that in a good American tradition, I got to see all sides. And then years ago, after being in the Middle East for years, I was at a conference in Jerusalem. And there I was hearing a message, and all of a sudden, all the politics disappeared. And I began to see what I believe is a divine perspective, Romans chapters 9 to 11. It's beyond politics, and it's very important, and it's prophetic. So it's from that I started to get my point of view.
And how has coming to this understanding of Israel and God's purposes and plans for Israel and the Jewish people, and really what we're seeing really is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy for over 2,000 years, and the prophets of Isaiah and Jeremiah are actually speaking into our day. How has the understanding of Israel in God's prophetic time clock really given you a greater understanding about the developments that are shaping today's Middle East?
If everything that's happening in the Middle East is merely just coincidence, we would be struggling to make sense, because there's a lot of irrational things. But when you understand it from a biblical and spiritual perspective, it makes a lot of sense. We are facing the glorious prospect of the end of this dispensation, this world order, the kingdoms of this world, to make room for the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. Again, I fervently believe that God loves all people. God does not play favorites, but yes, he is a God that elects. And if we see it from that point of view, then everything makes sense, because ultimately the conflict there is not political. It is spiritual and it's theological.
And really, what we're seeing, aren't we, Kamal, is a real change in the Middle East over the last 2 years. The Arab Spring has certainly brought a revolution in the Arab world. We've seen the falls of dictators like Gaddafi in Libya, President Mubarak in Egypt, also the Yemen government as well, plus incredible political and social upheaval and economic upheaval as well in the region. What would you think the main factors are for this really incredible changes that we're seeing?
What are the factors that are causing the change? There's several key factors. The Arab Spring is still, in my estimation, too early to call the shots or to call what's going to happen next. We could, I believe in the Middle East, we have to expect the unexpected. Sometimes the very thing you think is going to happen doesn't happen. Something very opposite. The Arab world is genuinely wanting democracy. If nothing else, because they're so well connected to the internet, the YouTube, the Facebook, they see how others live and they say, we want it too. It's a very normal response. And I think there has been a momentum long built up that has now caused the collapse of the dominoes. But it's interesting, the dominoes that have collapsed have all been, for the most part, secular autocratic regimes, not the religious autocratic regimes, at least not at this point. Those ones tend to be oil rich and they can give subsidies and giveaways and, buy some peace for now. I believe the internet's been a factor, although they've had revolutions long before internet. The yearning for democracy is a factor. And tired of police state, tired of being bullied, tired of always living in fear. All that has helped to contribute. And then you've got, if I may add, you've got 100 million under 30s in the Arab world. They've got time on their hands, many of them. They don't have jobs, neither are they in school. So that's plenty of time to communicate with each other and foment revolt.
And also what we're seeing as well, how much of what we're seeing really is the undercurrent of economics, and certainly since the 1970s, is something like the Arab world has had about 2% GDP growth rates. Yeah, actually in the region. So how much does economics play a part? Many poor, impoverished Arabs feel that they are not politically connected. Many of them feel that they don't really have so much of a future unless they actually take the future into their own hands.
Economics does play a part, maybe a major part, but I wouldn't say the only part. When you have it, for example, in Egypt, where prices are rising, basic foodstuffs are becoming almost out of reach for the average person. It's a maxim that whenever you lose control of the food prices, it's an invitation for social unrest. Egypt's one of those examples. And in addition, when they look around, some of them with a little bit of oil money or what have you, seeing that other countries with less resources are doing much better than they, that's a problem. I believe it was in 2002 and again 2009, the United Nations sponsored an Arab Development Report. So this was done by the Arabs, for the Arabs, and they concluded that in every area of society, the Arab world was going backward, where most other parts of the world were going forward. It's very interesting, too, that only in the Arab world, and I think in one part of Asia, has the rate of cigarette smoking actually gone up by 25% in the last 15 years. Everywhere else, it's going down. So none of this bodes well for younger people who want a future. And I believe that's part of the inspiration of the Arab Spring.
That's interesting because, I mean, we're coming to a stage now where if we look on our kind of news headlines dominated, I've got the Times in front of me, Egypt in turmoil as army oust president. And it was just about a year since the Muslim presidential candidate, Mohamed Morsi, won the elections. And now a year later, he's been thrown out due to large demonstrations and unpopular unrest. What do you make of what's happening currently in Egypt?
What do I make what's happened in Egypt? I think only God knows for sure, but a few things I observed. It is correct that Mohamed Morsi won a democratic election. That is technically correct, but he barely won it. I can't remember, with 52% of the vote. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood allegedly was taking lessons from the West on things like campaigning and how to be democratic and doing all the things in order to prepare for eventual takeover of government. I mean, I guess that's what any party does. But I am a little bit taken aback at once in power. Apparently they acted like they had a landslide and began to push radical reforms or radical changes in without the, shall I say, consensus that happens in democratic society. Simon, we have to remember, democracy is not just having an election. It's also what happens in between the elections. It's having a free press, independent judiciary, balance of power, checks and balances, human rights. When women and Coptic and other Christians were being marginalized in the last while, things like that do not lend to democracy or to enhanced or continued democratic legitimacy. Anybody who takes over leadership in a democratic context knows full well you don't bring radical change all at once. It's the frog in the kettle. Put them in the kettle, turn up the heat slowly.
Okay, very interesting. We've got a clip to go to now that is entitled The Egyptian Army Intervention, and President Adi Mansour is sworn in as the new interim president of Egypt.
Following the demise of Egyptian leader Mohamed Morsi in a military coup, the head of the Constitutional Court, Adli Mansour, has been confirmed as the country's interim president. Morsi is currently under house arrest, while Islamist television stations have been taken off air and dozens of Muslim Brotherhood supporters rounded up and arrested. Although Morsi was democratically elected last year, his attempts to enforce a pro-Islamist constitution polarized opinion in the North African state, leading to mass protests in capital Cairo and across the country. The move by the military to depose Morsi led to mass celebrations among millions of Egyptians, though it has created uncertainty in the international community. The United States is reviewing its aid to Egypt, while the EU and UN have urged Egyptians to use calm and restraint in their quest for a democratic future.
Welcome back to the Middle East report. We saw in that clip there the new interim president, Ali Mansour, has been put in place instead of President Morsi. And I believe that President Morsi and the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood are currently under house arrest and have been arrested. Now, surely this has implications for the military and also for the future of democracy in Egypt. Do you think that the military intervention on behalf of the military junta and the generals in Egypt was a wise move?
Look, I'm not an advocate of military coups and things like that, not normally. And it appears that Egypt has a second chance to get it right. I didn't wish for it, but it's happened, so let's live in reality. If they handle it correctly, like, for example, that they will put into place this roadmap for a democratic, shall we say, coalition, consensus-building coalition, if they'll do it in a good pace, they'll do it inclusively, and don't crack down too hard on the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, they are part of the polity there. They can pull it off.
which let's hope they do for the sake of stability and peace in Egypt, primarily because it is the most influential and biggest of all the Arab states, has the highest population in the Arab world. So the repercussions for what happened surely in Egypt have ramifications for the rest of the Arab world. But when we come down and actually have a look at what's happened, because incredible historic events, and for example, it shows really that the Egyptian people do not want to be under the Muslim Brotherhood or an Islamist government in Egypt. And what does that say really about the Egyptian people?
All right, well, I believe the Egyptian people, I'm not sure whether they're so much worried about the label. I believe they want democracy. They want to find their voice. They want to not have to live in fear that the police come knocking any time, or they don't want to be bullied anymore. The label may not be as important as the fact that there is all these organs of democratic government in place and functioning. One thing, though, that the Arab world needs to understand, it's nothing to do necessarily with Islam itself. It's a thing about church and state. We've learned the hard way, Simon, in the Western world. You don't mix church and state. You do, it's going to blow up in your face. And when church and state are mixed, minorities suffer, women suffer, those that are nonconformists suffer. And somehow some of the Arab masses think you can have it both. You can mix church and state, or in this case, mosque and state. We urge that people consider, keep them separate. At least that's what they've tried to do in Turkey, although Turkey itself is a transition. But I have noted that the Turkish Prime Minister has been telling the Arabs, be good Muslims, but have a secular constitution. So it's good advice, and I urge that people take it. But no, I think the Egyptian people want democracy. If any group tries to take control and there's not the checks and balances, they won't like it, and they may go to the streets at Tahrir Square yet again.
Okay, we've got a clip to go to now. It's entitled The Military Coup in Egypt, to give us a greater understanding of why the military decided to step in and force President Morsi from office.
Egyptian Defense Minister Abdel Fattah al-Sisi announced July 3rd that President Mohamed Morsi was removed from office. Speaking with members of Egypt's powerful Al-Azhar Religious University and Coptic Church Pope Theodorus II, al-Sisi instituted an interim government ahead of fresh elections that will be led by the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, Adli Mansour. Mansour will be sworn in July 4th before the General Assembly of the court, as the military hopes to smooth the transition from the ousted Muslim Brotherhood government to a broader interim coalition government hoping to meet the demands of the large-scale public unrest that began June 29th, ahead of the one-year anniversary of Morsi's term as president. The military will be on alert ahead of any possible violence between various political groups in reaction to the military's decision. But many of the Muslim Brotherhood's former political allies, including the Salafist Al-Nur Party and Al-Gama al-Islamiyah, are welcoming the call for fresh elections. This will make it difficult for the Brotherhood to generate enough public unrest to push the military to reinstate Morsi. Muslim Brotherhood supporters across the country, particularly within the Cairo suburb of Nasser City near Cairo University, are vowing to keep defending their ousted president and the electoral legitimacy of his government. Tensions have remained high for several days, and both opposition and pro-Brotherhood protests retain large numbers of people on the street. The question now is one of the Muslim Brotherhood strategy moving forward. The organization remains one of the largest and cohesive political machines within the Egyptian state. Though they risk being outlawed if they attempt large-scale violence in the streets, the movement is likely to leverage its considerable political and social networks to the military in an attempt to remain a part of any future interim government. Egypt's long-standing structural economic issues remain, and part of the Muslim Brotherhood's political success stems from their bread distribution schemes and social outreach programs. These have been crucial in helping to fill in the gaps of ongoing economic troubles besieging the Egyptian government since the ouster of former President Hosni Mubarak in February of 2011. The Muslim Brotherhood is not going to disappear overnight. It has had a great deal of practice surviving less than favorable political environments that it can fall back on. Having endured several decades of suppression under previous military-backed presidents, the Brotherhood will see today's events as the latest in a series of challenges toward their long-term goals. Today's coup has reset the political gains the movement has made in the past year, but Egypt's considerable economic and political challenges play to their strengths, and we should expect Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood to try and leverage their time-tested tactics to regain some of their political footing in the short term.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report, and that clip there was produced by Stratfor Intelligence, which provide excellent analysis of certainly key events that are shaping the Middle East. I want to discuss with you President Obama's response and to what's gone in Egypt. Now, this is a quote here. It says, President Obama said that he was deeply concerned about the events, saying, I now call on the Egyptian military to move quickly and responsibly to return full authority back to the democratically elected civilian government as soon as possible through an inclusive and transparent process, and to avoid any arbitrary arrests of President Morsi and his supporters. He's also talking about the possibility of cutting American aid to military aid to Egypt, which amounts to 1.3 billion US dollars. Is there a great danger here that President Obama, again with the Iranian presidential elections of 2009, is missing and failing to understand the mood of the Egyptian people, as he failed to understand the mood of the Iranian people in 2009 in his what seems to be in support of President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood?
I'm not 100% sure from your quote whether he's wanting the restoration of the previous civilian government or if he's wanting the restoration of a civilian government. I'm not sure by the quote. I think President Obama probably had to say what he said, because after all, the United States is meant to be a leading democratic nation and wanting to see democracy everywhere. So to say, oh no, it's fine, you can have a coup whenever you want, I'm sure he can't. He can't say that. If he is saying just restore democracy, then that's fine. What I think they were saying is they were going to review the military aid or the aid to Egypt, because I understand there may be a State Department regulation or somewhere in the U.S. government that you can't give aid to governments that came to power by military coups. Well, the thing is this, that if they move quickly, as they promised, to restore civilian rule and democratic organs, or to enhance and improve the democratic organs, then that shouldn't be an issue, because the aid is given once a year. I think that'll be okay. But as far as President Obama is concerned, he's a very bright man, but I tell you, even Solomon would be stumped what to do about the situation in the Middle East. America has it's the sphere of influence. It's clearly the American in the Middle East, more than anybody else. And America just doesn't know what to do. And I understand why they don't, because it's like a runaway train here. Where is it going to stop? Only God knows.
Which is very interesting. But if we look at the media coverage, and I've seen a lot of the media coverage on this new crisis in Egypt, certainly with the Muslim Brotherhood and President Morsi being deposed from office. I've seen so many reports on our mainstream news channels really referring to the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood were democratically elected, so therefore we have to support the forces of democracy, but they haven't really come out and say what is the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, what are they doing to the Egyptian people through their process of Islamicization, wanting to bring in a constitution that imposes the Muslim Brotherhood's Islamic worldview on the people of Egypt without their consultation. You've had President Morsi act as a pharaoh, saying that now I'm elected, there's going to be no further elections. And so the people then also presiding over what is effectively a dire economic situation, in which so many of the Egyptians, after they saw President Mubarak fall from office, feel that President Morsi has actually been worse than President Mubarak in terms of his autocracy.
Well, all I know is if you're looking at the situation in the last year from the accession to the deposition of Mohamed Morsi, it's been very breathtaking. Some of the things that have been done appears to have been a power grab, muzzled the press, and also the military. He sacked General Tantawi, the one he succeeded, and so, and then with they passed constitutional amendments barely, and there was no consultation or very little with the Coptic minority and others. Nothing about this appeared to be democratic whatsoever, except the election itself. So to say that he's democratic elected, yes, he was, but what about the rest of it? As I said earlier, democracy is what you have in between elections, not just the elections. So yes, it may be the military prevented a civil war in Egypt too, and we need to consider that option.
My final question on the issue of Egypt, do you believe now that the Muslim Brotherhood, who have pursued a policy of political engagement really since the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood in the late 1920s, and it's only now that they've actually come to power, do you think that because they've been ousted from power by the military junta in Egypt, that they could now actually pursue the violence and pursue the gun rather than pursue the democratic process?
That's a good question, Simon. Of course it could go either way. Muslim Brotherhood has been on record repeatedly saying they don't believe in violence. Muslim Brotherhood has said they want to be democratic and bring democracy to Egypt. Muslim Brotherhood has been involved, and astutely so, in charitable works, feeding the masses and what have you. If I were to advise them, I'd say stay the course and project a moderate image and a democratic image, because to do otherwise is just going to lead to trouble. And the military in Egypt, I think, is still pretty strong, and much of the Egyptian people would back them in that. So if I were them, I wouldn't do it. It's possible, but they may just have learned their lessons, take their knocks, and come to the party.
Yeah. And if we also bring in the issue of Syria now, because really Syria is at the forefront, isn't it? It's not only a civil war that has cost the lives of over 1,000 Syrians, according to the latest, 100,000, according to the latest UN report. It's also led to a refugee crisis of 1.5 million people, which threatens the stability of not only Jordan, but also Turkey and also Israel as well, and also it's become a haven for Al-Qaeda, who have joined forces with the rebels, and we're seeing a power play, aren't we, between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and it's a real conflict between Sunni and Shia identity and control of the Arab world.
The Syrian situation is, without question, extremely serious. Apart from the fact that you've got the Syrian population, 24 million, in an upheaval, this is a country that has had incredible stability. Oh yes, it's not been democratic. It's been under one-man rule for over 40 years, since 1970, and Assad taking power, senior Assad. Very stable, though, and a country where Christians were allowed to function virtually unhindered. There was not any known persecution of Christians in Assad's Syria. Well, since the start of that revolt, that has changed. As one very astute person said when I attended his lecture, he says, there's no really good guys in this one, because you have a dictator fighting to keep power, and then you've got an opposition that not only is very unknown to us, but is of dubious credentials, mixed with Al-Qaeda too. And the fact that Christians are being targeted, and they're 10% of the Syrian population, Simon. We're talking about over 2.4 million people are being targeted for no other reason that they are Christian. This to us should be of grave concern and something we should be praying about. Absolutely. But more than that, it's the fact the international community is getting involved. You've got the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, as well as the Americans now, allegedly reluctantly, but they're getting involved, along with the Saudis, the Qataris, all of them barracking for their own side, either for the Assad side or the other. Of course, the motivation of the Americans, the Saudis, and Qataris is to undermine Iran. Clear and simple. But this international involvement, I don't think is helping. I think it's actually hurting, and it's bringing instability to all of Syria's neighbors. That includes Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel. It's the kind of stuff, if not handled correctly, could lead to a world war.
And why do you believe it could lead to a world war?
Well, because, first of all, it already is an international conflict. Chinese, Russians, Iranians, Americans. That in itself, at this point, they're just sending arms. Well, no, excuse me. You got Hezbollah getting directly involved. So, first of all, it was just sending arms. Now you've got soldiers coming in. Hezbollah, at this case. Al-Qaeda, another. Even though, I mean, both Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda are not what I call national entities, but, you know, they do have their clout. So if it's not handled right, because Assad will put up a big fight, and he is backed by Russia and China and Iran and Hezbollah, and these are not minor players. To me, yeah, we thought Assad, he was being written off for months and months and months. Now people think he may actually make it. He may actually hang on. And of course, the other side's not going to give up very easily. So if it perpetuates, there's every possibility it could spread.
Isn't there, I mean, if we take, for example, President Bashar al-Assad's regime, which is made up of Alawites, which represent anything between 8 and 10% of the population, and the vast majority of Syrians are Sunnis, isn't the case that if President Assad goes and he's removed from office by the rebels, isn't there a great implication then that this will lead to the ethnic cleansing of the Alawites and possibly the Jews and his supporter as well? And his regime know this, and this is why they're fighting to the death.
If Assad loses because of the rebels militarily, then there is great danger of ethnic cleansing of Alawite, who are sort of like Shia, as well as, of course, Christians. I mean, it's in a sense already happening now, as I mentioned, with Christian populations in Homs and other places fleeing for their lives, or fleeing to Lebanon, or where have you. But if Assad is replaced because there was a negotiated settlement with international checks and balances and guarantees, there is a fighting chance for something different. But I'm just not sure, even with that, whether it will bring peace. It seems the best thing we could do is perhaps work with what we've got, with Assad planning a transition to a proper democracy, not the way it happened in Egypt. This one will take some time, but it's either be patient and work through what we've got, or have a bloodbath that can involve the rest of the Middle East and then drag the whole world as well.
And why is Iran so important to this in this equation? The fact that they are backing President Bashar al-Assad to the teeth. They are deploying something like over 4,000 Iranian troops together with members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. They're also bringing in their #1 terrorist organization, Hezbollah, to prop up his regime. Why is Syria so important to Iran?
Iran has vision, if nothing else. It was a great empire mentioned in Scripture, and there are several key countries in the Middle East that have had empires, including Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, as well as Iran. And if they could have their empires again, of course they would. Iran has vision. It wants hegemony. It wants hegemony in the Middle East. It wants hegemony or influence in the Muslim world. I mean, that's just called ambition. Syria is part of what we call a Shia crescent. King Abdullah II of Jordan spoke about it to anybody who cared to listen, building Shia-friendly regimes from Iran, then westward to Iraq, then to the Alawite minority-run Syria, and then, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon, literally a Shia crescent. And for a time, also sponsoring Hamas in Gaza, even though Hamas is Sunni, not Shia. And now you've got a major chain link of the Shia crescent in danger of falling. And Iran wants to do everything in its power not to let that happen. Some commentators say, well, Iran has a plan B if it does happen. Well, Iran may, but plan B will be a very poor substitute for plan A.
And your other major subject that you want to talk about, which is one that I don't know a great deal about, and that is Turkey. What influence is Turkey having, and what policies are they pursuing in the Middle East and the Arab world under Erdogan?
Simon, I tell people wherever I go that if you're going to watch any particular country in the Middle East, apart from Israel, watch Turkey. It's easy to watch Egypt because of the turmoil, and Egypt is important. It's easy to watch Iran because it's constantly in the news, and most of it is negative news. Both these countries are very important, but Turkey is really the one to watch. Now, there is a British man called Joseph de Kersey. He writes the Kersey Intelligence Brief. And Kersey, I've learned a lot from this guy, and one of the things he said years ago, and he would still say it till now, watch Turkey. And I couldn't agree more. Turkey is the hinge, I believe, the whole region swings on. It was, of course, the leader of the Ottoman Empire. They controlled much of the Middle East for centuries. Turkey is so important that the amazing thing is we know so little about it. It sits in the middle. It's got amazing links to not only Central Asia, mineral-rich or resource-rich Central Asia, Turkey area, but also to the Balkans in Europe. Some of the Muslims of the Balkans, of Europe, the white Muslim, European Muslims, came because of the Ottomans. In addition, the Turks sit just geographically in the center and call a lot of shots. Does Erdogan want to have a renewed Ottoman Empire? Well, many people think he does. I mean, time will tell. But the thing is, both Iran and Turkey want to win over the Arabs. And to do that, they must champion the Palestinian cause. And Erdogan has been beating the drums on that. And even, I can't remember exactly what time he did it, he made what is called an Arab Spring visit of the Arab world and said, look, you know, do as we do. Go secular, but still be good Muslims. They want that influence. But I basically think that neither Iran or Turkey, they may get temporary Arab street or Arab population support, but ultimately it will not last.
And if we look at the recent demonstrations that we saw in the capital, Istanbul, and Ankara and other major cities in Turkey, isn't there a growing awareness within Turkey itself that the country has moved away from its anchorage, which was the political secular ideology of Kemal Ataturk after World War I and the Ottoman Empire broke up and they lost that war. It was Kemal Ataturk who put Turkey in the direction of the Western world, and the alphabet changed from being an Arabic alphabet to a Latin alphabet, and the whole focus of the modern state of Turkey was secular in its ideology and that clear separation of church and state and mosque and state that you said earlier. Are the people of Turkey now beginning to realize that their whole secular constitution, their secular way of life is now under threat through Erdogan's Islamicization process of Turkey?
The demonstrations that have happened not just in Istanbul but across Turkey, I think, caught everybody by surprise, especially the Prime Minister. And because he has been very popular and he still enjoys a lot of support from key sectors. But it appears that the demonstrators happen to be the more westernized, urbanized, secularized, urbanized ones, educated ones, and they are concerned that there is an autocratic streak, that there is serious talk of changing the Turkish constitution, and that Mr. Erdogan can run as president of Turkey. He promised he would not run more than 3 times as prime minister, so this way he can keep his promise and stay in power too. They're not happy with the trend. I must hasten to add that Turkey is not having an Arab Spring, as Turkey does have democracy to some great extent. Erdogan does have electoral legitimacy, but people don't like the trend. And it came after wanting to redevelop a Gezi Park near Taksim Square. I mean, who would have thought that's going to cause such an uproar and cause it across the country? Time remains to be seen here what will happen. But apparently even Turkey has to understand there's some limits to people's patience when it comes to style of leadership. I think the economy also is a factor, because the economy has done very well for the last decade since the AKP, Justice and Development Party, has been in power. But it may be slowing. And of course, if that's happening, then people have an added impetus to complain.
Probably the most important question I'm going to ask you this entire interview is how does Israel play this game? Because on the south, she has to worry about the political and the social unrest in Egypt. Certainly was very concerned with President Morsi and the future of Israel's peace agreement with Egypt signed at the Camp David Peace Accords in '79. Then Israel is now being concerned about the civil war in Syria, which looks like it may spill over into Israel's borders, which threatens Israel's borders with Syria, and the conflict also spilling over to Lebanon, with Hezbollah massed with something like over 40,000 rockets capable of hitting Tel Aviv, Iran on the verge of nuclear weapons, and emergence of Turkey as a regional power. And also America's influence in the Middle East is waning under President Obama. So how does Israel respond to these challenges that seem very scary and very daunting?
Israel sits in the eye of the storm. It is a very stable place in a region that's not stable at all. What is so concerning is that in 2010, Israel has 5 neighbors: Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and the Palestinians. In 2010, only one of her borders was unstable, the one with Lebanon. Today, perhaps the only stable border is with Jordan, and even Jordan has to be watched carefully. Lebanon, the Golan Heights, Syria, Palestinian areas, been more unrest. And of course, the Sinai border. They've literally had to build a fence, which they haven't had required before, because it is so restive. What's so remarkable at Israel is that it is, of course, very concerned about the instability roundabout. They're concerned of the rise of Islamist governments roundabout. But even if Islamist governments took hold in every one of its neighbors, it'll be a while yet before any kind of threat to Israel would mature. Israel, at the same time, seems very calm. I was there not even, 10 days ago. And it's amazing. You would think you're almost in the millennium. It's so calm. And I asked a Messianic leader, what is it like for you here? I mean, we just come and visit and we go. What is it like for you? And he says, well, 2 things. We are preparing for war. We got our gas masks. We're cleaning out our bomb shelters. We see a lot of military maneuvers. We are preparing for war in case. He said, second thing is we get on with life as if nothing's happening. And that's the twin track they are in Israel. So they are watching. They are deeply concerned. But yes, none of the threats they face have matured. Even the Iranian nuclear standoff hasn't yet matured. That probably is the biggest single thing that they're biting the nails about, even though, yes, the Golan border is unstable for the first time in 40 years. So it's a twin track, but then the Israelis know how to, pardon the expression, walk and chew gum.
And we've got a clip to go to now that's entitled The Middle East Problem by Prager University.
You know, the motto of Prager University is you give us 5 minutes and we'll give you a semester. Well, I took many semesters on the question of the Middle East conflict. I was at the Middle East Institute, in fact, at Columbia University. That's where I did my graduate work. Semester after semester discussing the Middle East conflict as if it were the most complex conflict in the world, when in fact it's probably the easiest conflict in the world to describe. It may be the hardest to solve, but it really is the easiest to describe. And really, in a nutshell, this is what it is. Israel would like to exist and recognizes the right of the Palestinians to have a state. The Palestinians, however, and many other Muslims and Arabs, do not recognize the right of a Jewish state of Israel to exist. Every poll among Palestinians shows that the majority of Palestinians want there to be no Jewish state of Israel, doesn't believe that it should exist. or had any basis for being. And this has been true since 1948, when the British left and the UN established a division. Palestine will be cut in half, a Jewish half and an Arab half. The Jews accepted it, the Arabs didn't accept it, and what happened the moment it was announced? Arab armies, about 7 Arab armies, attacked the Jewish state in order to destroy it. To everybody's surprise, the little Jewish state survived, and that was pretty much it. And then it happened again in 1967 when the dictator of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, said we are now going to extinguish the Jewish state of Israel. And Jordan joined him and Syria joined him, but Israel attacked first, and so Israel survived. And that is how Israel, and only that way, came to occupy what was called the West Bank of Jordan, where many Palestinians live, because many Palestinians lived in that part of Jordan. So the war was over in '67, and what did the Arabs do? The Arab states all went to Khartoum, Sudan, and announced no recognition, no peace, and no negotiations. The 3 famous no's. What was Israel supposed to do? Then Israel made an agreement to give the entire Sinai Peninsula, an area of land bigger than Israel, with oil, back to Egypt, because they said they would make peace with Israel. Israel gives territory back for peace, and it will always do that. But is there really a desire for peace on the part of Israel's enemies, which broadcast after broadcast on TV and radio in the Palestinian areas is about how Jews should be killed and how Allah wants Jews to be killed? That's the typical broadcast on Palestinian television. And so it's not hard to explain the Middle East dispute. One side wants the other dead. You know what the motto of Hamas is? The motto of Hamas is, we love death as much as the Jews love life. Now you tell me, how is Israel supposed to make peace when people believe what Hamas believes? Now here is one of the most important things nobody talks about. Everybody talks about a Palestinian state. Why didn't anybody talk about a Palestinian state while the Palestinians lived under Jordanian rule? Because the truth is, people started talking about a Palestinian state once the Palestinians were under Israeli rule, because it was always a way to destroy the Jewish state of Israel. And I say Jewish state because that's what it is. There are many, many Arab states, but there's only one Jewish state. It is about the size of New Jersey. In fact, Israel is the size of El Salvador. El Salvador. And yet, if a Martian came to the Earth and they visited the United Nations, or they read the world's newspapers or watched world television, they would believe that the biggest problem on Earth is a state the size of New Jersey and El Salvador, this state of Israel. This preoccupation with a little democratic, humane state is absolutely irrational. And here's another question to be asked. If Israel tomorrow put down its arms and said, we will fight no more, what would happen? If the Arab countries around Israel said, we will fight no more, we put down our arms, what would happen? In the first case, there would be an immediate destruction of the state of Israel, with mass murder of the Jews of Israel. In the second scenario I presented, where the Arabs put down their arms and said, we just want peace, there would be peace the next Wednesday. The fact is, as I said at the outset, it is a very simple problem to describe. One side wants the other dead. And if they didn't, there would be peace. And yet, please remember this. There has never been, never in the history of the world, a state in that area, in what is called geographically Palestine, that was not Jewish. Israel is the third autonomous Jewish state to exist in that area. There was never an autonomous Arab state. There was never an autonomous Muslim state. There was never an autonomous any other state. That's the issue. Why can't a little state the size of El Salvador that calls itself Israel be allowed to exist? That, in a nutshell, is the Middle East problem. I'm Dennis Prager.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. And really, with that clip that we saw there, Kamal, it really does show, doesn't it, that Israel is really in the eye of the storm, that Israel is in the center of the Middle East. And that's primarily because God has a plan and a purpose for Israel and the Jewish people. How do you believe that God is working things out in the social and political turmoil that we're seeing now in the Middle East?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, Simon, and all I can do is offer some observation from Scripture, because that's really what I do. I'm a Bible teacher. I bring in the world trends where possible, because I believe, like the late British theologian John Stott said, practice double listening. One ear open to the Word and one ear open to the world. A Bible in one hand, a newspaper in the other. Or to become like the sons of Issachar, understanding the times to know what we ought to do. With that background in mind, it appears that there's greater focus and intensity about the Middle East in general and Israel specifically. The Scripture does talk about a time. It actually, when we talk about last days, we must see it not as monolithically dark. We need to see it as a time of contrasts, where the light gets brighter as the dark gets darker. There will be great focus politically on Israel and her neighbors, more and more pressure put on them that can be at times unbearable. Yet at the same time, in Israel and in Iran, in particular, the church is growing among Arabs, among Jews, and of course among Iranians. In fact, the church growth in Iran apparently is the biggest per capita church growth in the world, even greater than China per capita. It's astounding. So there is some good news. It's not all negative. But in terms of world events, I just see greater focus on the Middle East. You've had it with Gaddafi in Libya. You now have it with Assad in Syria. Sooner or later, the crosshairs will be on Israel. In the book of Zechariah, chapters 12 and chapter 14, it speaks about, first of all, Jerusalem being a burdensome stone for the neighbors or for the people round about. And Jerusalem has become a war cry, amazingly. When it's not, when it's in Israel's hands, it's the beloved city. And it hasn't always been the focal attention when it was in Arab hands or Muslim hands or what have you. It's never been a capital. It's never been beautified. It was languishing a lot. But now it's everyone's love. And I'm not in any way suggesting that Arab people don't have a love for Jerusalem. They do. But now it's become a major thing, more than it's ever been before. There will be a great tug of war, because ultimately the story or the status of Jerusalem is the single biggest issue, bar none. More than water, more than oil, more than borders, more than refugees, it's Jerusalem. As one person aptly put it, Jerusalem is a stick of dynamite and the Temple Mount's the fuse. The neighbors will get restless, according to Zechariah 12. And then it goes on to say, in these two chapters, that the whole world will go to war against Judah and Jerusalem. Think about it. If the world declared war against Gaddafi, the UN in particular, choosing to vote military action against a member state for events happening within its own borders, unprecedented, Simon. The Libyan intervention, and NATO dutifully complied, bombing Gaddafi night after night while claiming with a straight face they didn't want to kill him. No wonder the Chinese and the Russians were hopping mad. And then now we have Syria. And will the world get involved in Syria? Well, de facto it already is. Only a matter of time it will want to get involved in Israel too, as per Zechariah.
Okay, so when we're seeing these very monumentous events that are really shaping today's Middle East, we're seeing the fulfillment of biblical prophecy and the Word of God coming alive. As Christians, what is our responsibility to Israel, and what's our responsibility to the Middle East as a entity in itself?
Very good question. I think we need to, first of all, be as even-handed as we can. We know God chose the seed of Abraham for his purposes. I do believe in the Abrahamic covenant. I don't think it's been abrogated. I don't think it's disappeared. It's an everlasting covenant. So Psalm 122 verse 6 can apply. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper that love thee. But praying for the peace of Jerusalem isn't exclusively just praying for Jewish people. I mean, it's praying for all the people, because I believe Christ died for everyone. and that the gospel is for everyone. So we pray and should pray for security and peace for all people, for the spread of God's word among all people. I believe where we can help in a humanitarian way, that's always a good thing. I believe being informed and properly informed would do wonders, because it will not only help our intervention, or our intercession, excuse me, not our intervention, our intercession, as well as if we ever have to talk to politicians, we know what we're talking about. And I think the best thing we can do, of course, is, in addition to prayer and showing concern, we can also reach out to the people here, round about the block, people or migrants from the Middle East. Can I just say, especially for the Arab people, Palestinian people, the metaphor of Ishmael is very apropos. The sense of rejection, ejection out of a land they were living in, the fact that it wasn't, and even being rejected by their own fellow Arabs, even till now, and then wondering why it seems that Christian churches support the Jews but not support Christians in the midst. It's a complicated situation. We need to be, how shall we say it, caring for everyone, pastoral for everyone. Think of the metaphor of Ishmael. That could go a long way. That sense of rejection, being kicked out of the house, though you grew up in the house. If we understand that, we may be more able to minister to Palestinians and to Arabs at large.
Dr. Majid Dili, thank you very much for being my guest today on the Middle East Report, and thank you for bringing your knowledge, your expertise and your understanding. And I want to thank you all for watching today's programme as we see incredible events that are shaping today's Middle East. Let's continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and let's also pray that God really moves in a powerful way amongst the Arabs and also the Iranians. And thank you for watching today's programme.